Good afternoon and welcome. It's another time for Julius Mbaluto Live, and we are so happy that you are able to join us. We are coming to you, of course, from wherever you are, from the heart of London, or through the mountains, the seas. But of course, for those who are in the UK, we are very much local. So it's another day when we have this difficult question to ask. And of course, in today's show, we ask, does institutional racism exist in the UK? Let me repeat, does institutional racism exist in the UK? Of course, and then to find out answers to these questions, I'm joined by DeanOkaiSnr. DeanOkaiSnr. DeanOkaiSnr is the founder of the African Diaspora Public Affairs Committee, CIC, which came about after a 5-year mission to connect solution providers, advocates, professionals, and grassroots community organization to coordinate their collective efforts, especially for and behalf of British Africa Caribbean community to accomplish socio-economic self-determination. In our panel today, we also have Joel Olo. The second name is very much like my one. If I say it wrong, he's going to correct it. But Joel is a great man. He's in leadership and inclusion specialist. He's a leadership and inclusion specialist with a successful track record in strategic and operational leadership and change management for a wide variety of high-profile clients in the private, public, and NGO sectors. And it goes all the way, 30 years all the way. It's pretty much a lot of experience. And also Joel has been influential in a number of senior levels and has also sat as member of the UK Home Office Advisory Council on Race, Commissioner on the Deakin Commission into the Future of Voluntary Sector, and National Council for Voluntary Organization. Of course, they call it in short NCVO board, and he's a member of that as well. Of course, in terms of formulation of policies on these issues about inclusion, is very much informed. And of course, you viewers who are joining us from wherever you are, feel free to get involved, ask questions, give us your comments on Facebook, and we'll feel very much part of you. But first, what is institutional racism? We are talking about it. Everybody's talking about it. Is there a difference between racism and institutional racism? We want to get that very clear before we start, so we navigate this ship together. Institutional racism in the UK, this phrase came into being in 1999 due at the Lawrence Report. If many remember, Stephen Lawrence was murdered in a racist attack, and it came in place in 1999 Lawrence Report. And the definition of institutional racism, according to this report, is a collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. And also in this report, trying to define what institutional racism amounted to, they also added it can be seen as detected in processes, attitudes, and behavior that amount to discrimination through prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. So here we have 2021, fantastic Britain. We would think that we have made a lot of progress, but then a recent 264-page report by the UK government, which was chaired by Dr. Tony Sewell, and this particular commission report was known as the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparity Report, which was chaired by Dr. Tony Sewell. It concluded there is no institutional racism in the UK. And even it added, Britain should be regarded as a model for other white majority countries. And according to his own words in a clip by Channel 4, let's hear what he's going to say, Dr. Tony Sewell.
There are disparities. The interesting thing about this report is that it doesn't find those disparities landing in racism. It actually finds them in a lot of other things.
The report found no evidence of institutional racism, that inequalities are more likely to be caused by geography, poverty and culture than race, and that ethnic minorities are haunted by historic racism that doesn't exist anymore in modern Britain.
I assume you've had people come to you during this process who've said to you that they feel that their lived experience is one of institutional racism. Clearly you don't believe them. Are they lying? Are they deluded?
At the moment, people are just going around declaring institutional racism. Recently, somebody has declared that the whole education system is institutionally racist. And what they've done, they've devalued the term.
We look suspicious.
Figures show that black people are 9 times more likely than white people to be stopped and searched by the police. Dr. Sewell says that's not due to racism, but to high levels of crime within the black community itself.
We need to go back and look at issues around how they've been brought up, what's the socio-economic issues around them, family strain, some of the mistrust, some of the issues around masculinity, which have nothing to do with racism, because it's black men killing each other.
Simon?
Well. Extreme views there. I'm sure a lot of people have responded in a very unpleasant or negative manner to just to listen to that alone. And of course, people who have been living in this country, perhaps maybe they don't entirely agree with what Dr. Tony Sewell says. But of course, there are those who may also agree. Let me also start, by ourselves here, and I will kick off with you, Dean Okai. Yeah. What's your immediate reaction when you watch or hear what Dr. Sewell had to say?
Well, fortunately, our training in ADPAC behooves us not to react, but to respond. And look, a simple response is you would have to dismantle an entire government legislative system, definitely over the last 100 years, that was created to maintain a system of racial hierarchy, with English whites being IC1 and us getting bronze prize as IC3. Our historic relationship with Britain from the African Holocaust, excuse me, in maintaining the slave trade in the Caribbean, where we were out of sight and out of mind, was predicated on creating an economic wealth disparity between Africans and people of African origin and white English people, as we were invited after the Second World War to rebuild Britain under the Windrush generation arriving. Again, we were met with racism, but also racist policies. They come from government on high. None of that has changed. We'd have to dismantle that entire system created on a racial framework, from education all the way through employment to bank loans and everything else, which is systemic, which is about this whole network's wide web relationship with each other. So I'm going to give you a very succinct demonstration of why Britain is still institutionally racist. And we don't have to go back any further than 2020. So as Prime Minister, former Home Secretary, Theresa May, she designed a hostile environment for African Caribbean specifically, and the Windrush generation and the children of that Windrush generation. What she did was have an effective communication with her Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, who illegally ordered the destruction of naturalization records of that Windrush generation and their children at the Home Office. As the boss of that Home Office, they were forced to obey her instruction. She then further coordinated with immigration, law enforcement, the DWP, the local authorities, and the NHS to create a hostile environment for African Caribbeans that specifically sought to strip them of their assets, kidnap them, and deport them without any kind of recompense from the British Treasury whatsoever. Fortunately, we are well placed at the highest echelons of every single industry and institution in Britain. And a whistleblower let us know that as a result of that, they had illegally destroyed the records and sought to get rid of us because they no longer require our services after being invited to rebuild Britain. Nothing has changed since then.
Mr. Okai. And of course, what about you, Joel? Are you on the side of Tony Sewell? Does what he says resonate with you, or maybe your experiences tell you otherwise? What has been your experience?
Well, thanks for having me, Julius. It's great that I'm having some groundings with my brothers. Walter Rodney once wrote a book about groundings with his brothers. It would be nice to see some sisters here next time too, because I think the voices that I've been hearing, which are voices that are speaking articulately against the nonsense of the disappearance of institutional racism, are both male and female. And the director of Runnymede has been quite articulate on disclaiming these claims. So let's begin by the term institutional racism, because everybody's attributing this to William Macpherson. And so William Macpherson, quite rightly, used the term and defined the term. But this goes back all the way to 1967, when Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture. Some of you might know that he's, one of the Black Panthers that were essentially fighting against apartheid, which is what the situation in USA at the time was. Black people didn't have the vote. Black people weren't able to go through the front door of hotels, even if they were performers on stage and so on. So he wrote this book about Black power and the politics of liberation and coined the term institutional racism. What then happened after Stephen Lawrence died, the Macpherson Inquiry codified it in law. And you've already read to us exactly what it says. And it's important because it says that institutional racism can be seen and detected in processes. Those are the institutional things, the way that organizations organize, the policies that they have in place, and then the attitudes of the individuals. Now, I've been around a long time in the UK. I came here as a 5-year-old boy in 1961. So I can tell you the attitudes that I encountered then and the attitudes that I encounter now are different, markedly different. People don't come up to you and say to your face, often anyway, perhaps it's the circles I move in, they don't often come and call you, an offensive name. But under the counter, behind your back, when no one else is listening, you get these attitudes. The Prime Minister himself has talked about Islamic women looking like letterboxes. I don't know if you find that term acceptable, but I certainly don't. So, that is the behavior that I find unacceptable. So if we're talking about the elimination and the disappearance of institutional racism, has the processes moved? Have the attitudes moved? Is the behavior markedly different and entirely eliminated so that individuals like myself and like my brothers who are around the table today can be quite confident that they're going to be treated like everybody else? Well, that is, in my experience, is not the case. We'll have more time, but I'd like to go back to the original sin of racism in this country. So racism existed long before the transatlantic slavery, but the transatlantic slavery was a particular moment when it became an industry. And guess where that industry began? Right here in the United Kingdom. This is where the industry was invented. 60 million Africans died during slavery. 10 generations of people who were forced labor and had no control over themselves, were chattel. So 60 million. In contrast, 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. They called that a Holocaust. Well, if 10 times that amount of people die, because somebody decides they're going to exploit them, exploit Africans for the benefits of the West and this country, then we certainly can claim that as our Holocaust. And that Holocaust, the implications and the ripples of that Holocaust is still with us, because discrimination didn't end when slavery ended in 1865. You know, we then had 150 years of racial discrimination. So coming to this country as a small boy, we were faced with the no dogs, no Irish, no blacks. Well, you could see my name is Irish. That's why you're having difficulty pronouncing it. You know, so no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Well, guess what? I was both Irish and black. So only the dogs were doing better than us. And if you had a dog, hey, woe betide, you were in trouble. So all of those things we went through and are still going through. And I'm surprised that, you know, my grandchildren are still hearing the same things in the playground that I used to hear. And that was 2 generations ago. So when we talk about the disappearance of racism or institutional racism, we can dance on the head of a pin, whether it's institutional, personal, or individual. You know, this is the attitude that we are inferior people, created during the transatlantic slavery, and that has been going on since then, 150 years of it since then. I view Tony Sewell and this pack of people as quislings. They're Holocaust deniers. They're the lost ones. I just hope that they will revisit the nonsense that they're speaking, and I hope that they find their way back to us. I hope they find their way home.
Opinion. Just on the ground, to be ourselves the question, who is on the right? Is it Tony Sewell, or is it also leaders in this country who see it better than himself and the report that has been produced? So let's see the second clip and by BBC, courtesy of BBC.
The publication of today's report on the killing of Stephen Lawrence must lead to new attitudes, a new era in race relations, and a new, more tolerant and more inclusive Britain.
One young black girl had to change her name to Elizabeth before she got any interviews at all. This, in 21st century Britain, is disgraceful.
That means fighting against the burning injustice. If you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system than if you're white.
I think the previous consensus...
Well, those are 3 different former British prime ministers. They are actually confirming institutional racism exists. If we listen to what they are actually talking about, there's no denial there that institutional racism exists. We're back in the country, beautiful Britain, over here, a couple of years back. If we even want to go to more examples, the former BBC director, Greg Dyke, he became the director of BBC, an institution which is British, and he's also British. And in his own words, after doing extensive research on who was working, who was employed as to what, and which section they worked, he made a conclusion, and this is Greg Dyke, BBC director. He said BBC was hideously white at the top. What does that mean? You may find a lot of junior staff working within the organization, but when you went up to the top of the hierarchy of the BBC, you never found any senior person. Now they started to disappear, and that's why he coined the phrase, BBC was hideously white at the top. This is a BBC director, not me, not any other person, not any you are any other black and ethnic minority of that, although that term has been disputed lately. It's not anyone from there, it's from the horse's mouth. And also another example would be a couple of years back, there was a BBC journalist, he disguised himself to and applied to be recruited within the British police. And he ended up doing a documentary that is known as The Secret Policeman. And while he was there, he was a journalist. He wanted to really establish whether racism existed within the police force. And he managed to film all these officers talking about they stop people based on the color, the color of their skin or whatever. And it was a big thing, costing senior police officers to resign after it was aired. This is still Britain, where Tony Sewell tells us institutional racism doesn't exist. So, I mean, yeah, when you watch those few clips, what comes to your mind? And maybe we start with Mr. Okai.
Yes, sir. So, look, John made a fantastic point about the African Holocaust. And I think what we aren't acknowledging is that a Holocaust was a result of open warfare from this tiny British state that had superior arms against Africans. That war has never ceased to take place. And when we make a comparison to ourselves and our distant Eastern European cousins, the Germans lost in their campaign against the world and their tyranny of Eastern European Jews. The tyranny of Britain against Africans has never stopped because Britain won. So since Britain won that military campaign that continues in many different ways, today it's applied behavioral psychology and also open warfare on our continent, being economic warfare and direct warfare because they have air bases, as does America, on the ground, and troops that are installed in these nations. So we can't underestimate that the arbitrators and perpetrators of our Holocaust won the war. Nothing has ceased to stop. It is business as usual, and we haven't done anything to address that. So the direct reparations movement we have, which is fought so fiercely, not only here, but in the United States, isn't about not recompensing us. Fiat currency is valueless. They're not concerned with the money. It is about keeping us disempowered to sever our relationship with the continent, which would make us infinitely stronger, and also allows them entry into the continent with us not having any value for the ground which we have relation to via our ancestors.
Well, what does this new clip mean to you when you watch former prime ministers talking about the same problem existing?
Well, I think they're just speaking the obvious. I mean, it is obvious that discrimination exists, and racialized discrimination has existed in this country for 500 years, in a systemic form. So Dean has been quite articulate in talking about the institutional relationship that sets Black people against the system and against sometimes our white counterparts. So it's important, number one, to recognize that that isn't just a dream reality. We're hearing it from David Cameron, Theresa May, and others. These are people who you probably wouldn't expect, because they have also been culpable in establishing institutions and maintaining institutions where discrimination exists. But you wouldn't expect those voices to be saying those things, and they did. So how is it that we are placing so much emphasis on this one lone voice, this one lone commission, which has established somewhere that we're a model of white societies? Somewhere in this universe, Britain, of all countries, this is where slavery started. This is where that whole debacle started. Suddenly we've transformed in a matter of 150 years since slavery. We have now transformed into a society which is a model society. Dean picks up the question of reparations, and I think it's a valid point, and it's something that we have to discuss, because at the end of slavery, in 1867, they decided that they were going to give 40,000 awards. This government gave 40,000 awards to the slave owners to compensate them for the loss of the trade. So these things are endemic. They are part of government policy. They support the system that we live in. The question is, what do we do about them? And what we do about them, and what I've spent, most of my life trying to do is, number one, campaigning against racial discrimination where we see it. So I've had campaigns, I've been involved in campaigns against the SOS laws, and even now, today, we still find that young Black people are 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched than their white counterparts. So we haven't yet solved that problem. That part of racial discrimination, institutional racism, hasn't disappeared. We still have work to do. The police service has made some strides, and nobody would deny that. But certainly, once we start saying you've got there, then all of the efforts to get where we are and make progress, people will stop and probably turn the hands of the clock back. If we're going to be looking for institutional racism, let's look for the big institutions, and if there is no institutional racism in those institutions, then we can go home and say, well, okay, we might be edging close towards being a model society. The biggest institution in this country is the National Health Service, where most of Black professionals work. Most of Black professionals work in the NHS. They're nurses, doctors, radiographers, individuals who've spent their life getting the qualification and getting to the top of their game, and then being employed in an institution that has already been deemed to be racially discriminatory. Yeah, and there's a lovely report by a man called Roger Klein, who talks about the snowy white peaks, because whilst you have something like 300,000 people who are Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds in the NHS, you have a small handful in the whole range of trusts up and down the country of people who are chief execs, medical directors, and so on. So there's still a long way to go. And when they look at themselves, when they look at their processes, which they do on a regular basis, they say we have institutional challenges. The way we recruit isn't fair. The way we allocate training opportunities isn't fair. The way we develop individuals in the organization isn't fair. And these are not just fair because individuals are discriminating or prejudiced. These are patterns of behavior which is enshrined in the way that the organization operates, either by omission, so they forget to sort the policies out so that people can get a fair crack at the whip, or by commission. They don't want you here, so they set the system up so that you can't be here and you can't get something which you're entitled to because your talent takes you there. So Simon Stevens, who is the chief exec of the National Health Service, has on a number of occasions accepted that there is institutional discrimination and has set about working towards ways that that can be changed. I spend a lot of my working life helping organizations get to the point where they can challenge the discrimination which is embedded in the system and move forward and give everybody a fair crack of the whip. Because actually what we're asking for is what anybody can ask for, is that, number one, we're treated fairly. Number two, if we have an ability, if we have a talent, then that talent shouldn't be blocked because of the color of the skin. So those are two things we're asking for. What Black Lives Matter asks for is just to matter. And the furore that you hear about Black Lives Matter, people say, well, does that mean that white lives doesn't matter? Look, we're having to fight just to matter. That's the lowest common denominator. We're fighting to matter. Imagine that. In 2021, we're still fighting to matter, and for people to give us the recognition that our lived experience, which is one of experiencing racism wherever we go, and the evidence is there in all of the statistical and data analysis, we're fighting for our experience to matter. When Tony Sewell and others come up with these sorts of reports, then that goes against the fight. They are on the opposite side of the battle for progressive change, where we can be a non-racist, anti-racist society. And that doesn't mean that, this is the fight that just Black people should engage in, because we need to find allies. And I think Black Lives Matter showed that allies count. After all these years, the coalitions that we have built over the years are the ones that have helped us move forward. So we have ways to go.
Indeed. And Dean, we saw the Black Lives Matter triggered by the death of George Floyd in the US. Of course, at the same time, when I was covering this story about Black Lives Matter, I'll go everywhere in the UK. I mean, in London, you see all these people talking about don't focus on US, focus here. It's happening. Is that the case? I mean, and if so, by what scale?
So I can give you a direct name now. Osim Brown, who was a Somalian young man in Luton, who was arrested by the police, severely assaulted in the time that he was incarcerated, released with injuries, who went home and died of his injuries. Now, this is a young man who was released without charge, which goes to the institutional racism within the police force of racially profiling our young men. Now, if this is still happening here and that happened this year, where has this so-called racial model come from? We would have to dismantle all of the structures that were put in place to maintain a racial hierarchy, a racial hierarchical system that has existed for 100 years. In any case, there's one point I wanted to make about the NHS, because we do work very closely with Equality for Black Nurses, which is Naomi Bennett's organization. She's the founder. Now, she is a senior nurse. She's an inventor of a product called the NeoSlip, which is created to holster wounds to aid their recovery. She was in her car with a friend coming back from a party when she was physically dragged out as a woman in her mid-40s who is a professional and treated like a criminal. Her charge was resisting arrest and panicking. They then went to take her to court to charge her with impeding justice based on that resisting arrest. Resisting arrest isn't a charge. It goes into what I call the policing and the politics of racial dog whistling. She set up this organization as a result of her frustration, which is exactly why ADPAC is here. And I envisage Joel becoming a very strong delivery partner. But to get to the point of Equality for Black Nurses, Equality for Black Nurses has informed us that most of the nurse complaints made against African and African Caribbean nurses come from white nurses, whereas most of the English white nurses' complaints come from patients. Therefore, we see this is about institutional racism. We then explored in terms of solutions, creating an app called the National Log for the public sector to be able to report and chronicle all forms of bullying, racial profiling, so it could plug into the court systems. And then we're going to start to understand the cross-cutting themes as we get to the qualitative and quantitative research and the data collection, which is very important. A lot of tech is going into the back end of what ADPAC do in terms of advocacy, so we can really start to protect our public workers, who will then start to feel more bold to make a difference in challenging these institutions on behalf of our almost 3 million population UK-wide, 2 million in London. And I just want to close on this point because Joel made an excellent point about allies. ADPAC has aligned with the mayoral candidate, Brian Rose, who's a fantastically innovative candidate, a viable candidate, which is why Sadiq Khan continues to mirror this language of it's a two-horse race, because he knows that Sean Bailey is a donkey who is a collaborator in the same racist system designed to bring about benign neglect for African Caribbean people in ignoring our problems and gaslighting us in exactly the same way that you've seen Kemi Badenoch, Kwesi Kwarteng, Tony Sewell, and Priti Patel do on a regular basis. And the reason for that benign neglect is to bring in a policy, again, of a hostile environment for us as the country breaks down, as it inevitably will after this lockdown, where people are made poorer than they've ever been at any time in the 20th century, never mind the 21st.
Well, indeed. And let's maybe take some reactions from recent reactions from MSN News by angered readers on the, just after the report was released. We've got one person talking about saying that it does, when you talk about does, institutional racism exist in the UK, he says it does exist in many forms and is a growing issue for the government. To claim that it doesn't exist is dangerous, belittling, and racist. Another person on that, MSN News covered, her name is Jasmine Mohammed. She says the UK isn't a good model for white majority countries, despite the findings of the report. We are just as bad as everyone else. There are actually laws and legislation about racial equality in the UK. And then he says, I know it's there to make things equal, but the fact that it has to be there shows that there is institutional racism. Because if it wasn't for these laws, would we still integrate? And when you look into those two positions, and the third one is Georgia Austin. She says the government are delusional. The racism is so deeply ingrained in them, they can't possibly unlearn it. They're too far gone. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts? Are they too far gone to see it?
Please, Joel, go ahead.
Thank you, Dean. First of all, it's a coincidence of history that this report was released pretty much about the same time that George Floyd's trial started. I think they were impaneling the jury and so on. So one day I woke up with this split screen of Tony Sewell and his colleagues talking about, Britain being a model country for white, whatever that is. And on the other side of the split screen is people going into the witness box, talking about how they're emotionally traumatized. This is after a year, having flashbacks, bad dreams about seeing that man with his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes. Yeah.
Although we cannot talk so much
out of
about
that
case because he's a live case, we wouldn't talk so much about the George Floyd case.
Well, it's just the juxtaposition of those two things. One country coming to terms with racial discrimination, which I think America is, and saying, look, this is where we are, in terms of voting rights, in terms of rights that Black people have, in terms of where they sit in institutions and so on. This is not a good place, and we want to do something about it. That's an honest position. And on the other hand, you've got these people saying, well, we are the great holy grail. This is the place that you in America ought to aim at, without recognizing that all of the reports that's gone before, pretty much all of the reports, and there's thousands of them, have actually proved the case. So what they've done is to say, hey, look at this shiny object. Forget all of the evidence. Look at the shiny object over here. And here we are talking about the shiny object. What we need to be talking about is what we really need to do about racial discrimination, and institutional racism as it exists in this country, because it clearly does exist and there is work to do. So we want to think about how we can form alliances. We want to think about how we can join with other organizations. Dean, glad to meet you on this call. We will catch up and talk about our strategies for moving ourselves forward out of this situation. Racism is not something that's in the interest of most white people. It's in the interest of some white people, but to keep it in place does not serve the majority of white people. So we have to work out a way that we can bring those allies along with us, explain our position, and I think we're moving forward. I think Black Lives Matter allowed us to just knock away the notion that we're just serial complainers. We make a lot of loud noises about something about nothing. Yeah. So Black Lives Matter got us to that position, where white people were saying, actually, you know what, I don't want to live with this, particularly the young generation, saying that's not the society that I want to go forward with. And what these sorts of things are attempting to do is to hold back the tide of that progressive movement. It will not work. We are going forward and we're going to make progress regardless of Tony Sewell, regardless of a government that supports that position, regardless of anything that anyone says. You know, I think the tide is in our favor and we're going to float this boat and get to a place where there is no racism in this country.
Thank you. Dean, what's your take on that?
Yeah. So look, when it comes to the race and racial disparity laws that are put in place, unfortunately, African Caribbean men and women are always the first people prosecuted under them. And it was an African Caribbean man who was the first prosecuted under those laws as they were established at their embryonic stages. When it comes to what Black Lives Matter did, they put the light on the Wizard of Oz, and they pulled back the curtain, who is now the Wizard of Woz. So what is our role in all of this? It isn't so much to go towards government and make a single request, because racism is economic. And the only way that we can become in a position to circumvent the effects of racism largely is to have parity. Parity is something of our own creation. This is really important to understand, because nothing given can be sustained. So if we are asking for it, we cannot sustain it. So it is a time, and this is why ADPAC formed, to create transformative policy and to be able to put that policy into practice by aligning us economically. So we're working with bankers to create ventures that specifically and exclusively protect the interests of African Caribbeans in the UK, but more importantly, connect us to the continent through the State of the African Diaspora Region Council in a very similar way to the way that Eastern European Jews and Israelis work in the United States through ADPAC. A strong Israel represents strong Jews, and a strong Africa represents strong Africans. But the relationship needs to be economic. So we have drives to connect British and African entrepreneurs to create manufacturing plants on the continent that are joint ventures where we now have genuine allyship and we can add to the growth. And we're working with a macro economy so we can really go in there and make a huge impact. And then because countries like Ghana have replaced the European Union, there are no import or export tariffs between Britain and Ghana. So now we can create clear manufacturing districts on the continent, export the things back to Britain, make maximum profit for both parties, and create a pipeline that grows intra-African trade and intra-African diaspora trade. When we have parity, then we can approach the British government, whilst at the same time concurrently defending, advocating, and attacking them where we need to in a coordinated way with all of our grassroots organizations nationally, so that we start to speak with a singular voice towards our interests. And ADPAC has also sought to back the We Matter Party, and specifically candidates Huey Rose, who's running for councillor in the Enfield ward of Southbury, and Desmond Jeddo, who's running for the Police and Crimes Commissioner in the West Midlands. We can make a transformational impact by having an African Caribbean man as the Police and Crimes Commissioner, where he has empathy for our cause and no malice towards the police, but will definitely hold them accountable for a transformative and representative police force of the communities that they serve.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you see racism, whether it's your typical racism as an individual, you experience on the day-to-day life, or even institutional racism, none of that is really good for anybody. It does have an impact on you as an individual. I remember by my days in university, I would meet fellow students, some of them pretty desperate. They're like, okay, what's the point of even the education? Because we hear there's a top ceiling in any corporate. What does that mean? Top ceiling in any corporate. They're saying that, number one, you may face difficulties when you are being recruited. And even while you are in the organization, you may find making progress to senior levels is pretty much hindered by what we call now institutional racism. But to illustrate that point very clearly, not long ago, there was a report, a research and report conducted by YMCA, and their findings are really not what you expect, but it's not really great, because they're saying that the research found that young Black people feel that racial stereotypes have the potential to negatively impact their education. And they are also saying that in the same report, 95% of young Black Britons have heard and witnessed a racist language in school. So, I mean, how does this come across to you? If we start with you, Joel.
Yeah, I'm almost tired of hearing the negative data, because I've been hearing it for 60 odd years now. And I think we need to focus in on where we can make most progress. And that is different for everybody, I accept that. I'm no longer a board member of NCVO, let me just correct you on that. But I am an advisor to the Black Training and Enterprise Group, which is based in London and has been working for 30 years around employment, around getting particularly young Black men into jobs. As you know, they are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than their white counterparts. So that's something that we have to work on. So BTEC does a whole range of things, helping individuals to reach their career goals, mentoring programs, all of those things I certainly support. We also do some work around the criminal justice system. And as you know, 23% of people who are arrested are Black, 21% of those convicted are Black, 27% of the people in prisons are Black, and we're only 16% of the population. So there is that disparity that we need to get hold of. When I looked at the figures and tried to understand why people were being arrested and convicted, when it comes to Black individuals, 40% of them have been arrested and prosecuted for drug offenses. Now, you might know that cannabis is something that is used in the Caribbean community and the African community liberally. Rastafarians use it as part of a ritual. So people have been picked up for years for small amounts of cannabis and thrown in jail. And lo and behold, Canada, America, and a whole range of other places have now liberalized on that. They've decided that cannabis is medicinal. And big corporations are moved into that space and are making money, yet our brothers are still in jail for having a spliff in their pocket. That's wrong. So we need to get those sentences expunged. Need to get people out of incarceration, because that's just a life-changing situation for anybody who finds themselves in there. We're still finding ourselves in a place where our young people, young boys particularly, are more likely to be excluded from schools than their white counterparts. They can't go into a shop, a newsagent, wearing a hoodie. They're banned from doing that. Yet everybody can walk anywhere with a mask over their face, concealing their identity. What is the ridiculousness of that? If that isn't racial profiling, what is? Yeah, it's certainly not for security, because we now have got around for the last year with our faces concealed, despite the fact that we have all of these CCTVs. Yet still, young Black people can't go into a shop wearing a piece of clothing, which actually we don't even manufacture. So there is work to be done. I think that we need to individually decide where we can put our shoulder to the wheel, where we can make most progress, and join together with others to push that through. And let me underline the point about allies. It's so important that we make alliances across the board. I know that I used to work in Notting Hill, where Frank Critchlow and others were, struggling to maintain a Black community in North Kensington. And one of the key things for them was to maintain their culture in that place. And the individuals who were supporting this were people like Mike Mansfield, Gareth Pierce, and so on, white individuals, white barristers and lawyers who had our backs. You know, every time we got arrested, they were the ones who came and bailed us out. We were arrested for, you know, fighting for our civil rights, and we were bailed out by those individuals. So you can't discount those alliances. They're important, they're powerful, and they're in government. And we would find them in some of the strangest places because, you know, despite the fact that the Tory party often works against our interests, there are individual Tories who will stand up because they understand the right thing and they're willing to stand up for the right thing. So we've got to peel those people away from the likes of Tony Sewell and this report, you know, and talk to them seriously about how they can use their power and influence in those places where they have it to move the dial forward. Back to you,
Yeah,
Julius.
thank you for that. Thank you for that. What about you, Dean? And probably a different question as well to add on to what we shared is that, of course, when you look into all these disparities in organizations, in places of work, in the society, could we advocate for affirmative action that a certain percentage should be given out if it's employment of an organization to employ this percentage of people from Black and ethnic minorities? Or should it be let laws be formulated, let policies be formulated as well, and let them be effected and active in organization to just create an equal playing ground whereby everybody can compete on their own merit?
To be quite frank, a repetition of anything we've done politically in history is a complete waste of time and for optics. We're past the point of politics where they can be optics. It has to be transformational policy. And that's only going to come as a result of us creating parity. So in terms of asking for anything, nothing given can be sustained. You've got to take it. And there is a point where we've actually got to step away from engagement with government. Not totally, because our actions must take place concurrently. We have advocates who keep pressure on them, but what we need to do is build up our own structures for advocacy. So when Joel was speaking earlier about BTEG, I know BTEG as a relationship from Access UK and the work that Jeremy does. We have created a program called the School to Industry Pipeline, which is a national framework in the public health approach, not developed with the so-called mainstream organizations, but delivered with designed with a matrix of grassroots, culturally competent organizations nationally to have a digital project management tool that then coordinates their national activity to create wraparound care for the African family, to focus on the African Caribbean child. Now, this is designed to stem serious youth violence in a transformative way, not only by creating opportunities, but a clear and identifiable pipeline all the way from early intervention that looks like rites of passage for African Caribbean young men and women, supplementary schools, which are culturally competent, that make them confident citizens in going out. And this all happens for us, however, the funding that we require is on the other side of the wall, as Joel well knows. So the point of the collaboration behind the national initiative is where we say you'll no longer speak about us without us being in the room, making critical decisions with our key decision makers. No longer will Red Thread be able to go and get contracts on our behalf where they siphon off a huge top layer of money and then trickle down crumbs to the third tier organizations like BTEG or any of the grassroots organizations who are actually going to do the work. This is transformative policy. We have allies inside in what I call an inside-outside policy, where we don't know each other, but we get on very well. And based on their empathy of our movement and the progress that we have to make, we make the noise as a pressure group from the outside. Then we have the structures to actually receive the benefits. And all they need to do is gently mirror in a very palatable way what we say on the inside. And it creates a funnel where the resources come to us to transform the lives of our young people where they can't slip through the net. None of our young men or women should be in schools which create a schools to prison pipeline. The schools to industry pipeline is preferable for everybody except the 6 privately built new prisons that we're not speaking about that need huge populations to make them profitable. And this is why they designed legislation via lobbying, such as joint enterprise, which is why they have the gangs matrix that will connect our young men to murders that they may not have necessarily had anything to do by association. And this is where we look at institutionally racist policy that becomes policy put into practice.
Thank you very much for that. JJ, do we have any Facebook comments?
At the moment, we do not have any. So
No
but
problem.
we've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so therefore, which is the way forward then? Of course, we heard that kind of suggestions that you have made, which is brilliant. But to a typical child walking on the streets, going to school, or even going to uni, they lived in a culture. They heard about top ceiling. Do you want to tell them that top ceiling exists, or what do you want to tell them? Or we tell them life is up to you. You can decide your own destiny by your brilliant performance. Why should they be inspired to go to school if there's a top ceiling? What are we going to do to break these invisible top ceilings?
Since we have 5 minutes, I'm going to round up in 1 minute. I spoke about the schools to industry pipeline. It's all about identifying the mentors and the caretakers of the community that can get you to the next level. So be that WYLA, 100 Black men, where they're going to create a pipeline that introduces you to professionals at whatever stage you're at. Exposure leads to expansion. And when we identify us in companies where they have professional Black networks, you can have a mentor that is going to create a pipeline to bring you in and is going to nurture you and track you as talent going along this pipeline. It's all about understanding where we are at the highest echelons of all industries and creating that clear pipeline from 3 to university that can seamlessly guide you into a career path. And you're young enough to recover. You can change your mind 4 or 5 times in the duration of that pipeline. But going in from early intervention with organizations like Origin HQ, WYLA, Manhood Academy, MAG, 100 Black men, and they have female counterparts for all of those organizations that also deliver parental training to create ideal cultural practices for the family. And I don't want to hog too much time for you, Joel, in closing, sir.
Yeah, exactly. Joe, it's your turn. We say no to affirmative action. And yeah, what do you have on mind then?
Yeah, well, funny enough, in my practice, we often are advocating something called positive action. This isn't quotas. This is where you give people the support, the kind of support that Dean talked about, getting individuals to be mentored, developed, so that they can compete well when they get to the point. There's also a cultural component of that because they have to understand the system in which they're playing. If they don't understand the system, they're less likely to win out in the system. One good thing I think this report does highlight is the fact that in terms of education, at least, Black people are moving forward. Strangely enough, Tony Sewell used to claim that Black mothers were the problem in a past report, that they weren't strong-arming their boys, and so their boys were likely to get into knife crime and other things. But those same people have come trumps. It shows that they're getting the educational qualifications that we would expect, and in some places excelling. There are still some groups, and mainly the African Caribbean boys, who still need some work. But I would say to them and say to their families, whether there is a single parent or whether it's grandmother looking after them or whatever it is, tell the kid the same thing I was told. Racism doesn't stop you. Yeah, racism gets in the way. You have to find a way around this. You have to find a way around this. Education can be one way. Business can be another way. Whatever your talent is, find a way. It could be singing, it could be dancing, whatever it is. Find a way, but don't let racial discrimination be the psychological block to where you're going to get. It's a given. It's in this society. We are institutionally racist in this country. There's no doubt about that. And individuals who want to get through that have to find ways to modify those institutions, fight to make sure that we are able to conduct ourselves and get to the level where we deserve in the organization. So we have to work twice as hard to get half as far. That doesn't mean to say you don't work twice as hard. I've always worked 3 times as hard to get to where I am, because nothing was going to stop in the way of what my mother told me. You're the best individual human being on earth. You could do anything. And I think every morning that you get up, you tell your children that, they'll get where they're going.
Thank you very much for that. I always look myself in the mirror and I tell myself, you're a great guy. I'm just joking.
we are the mirror. You are a great guy.
But it's up to us. It's up to us. Where we want to be is up to us. It's really up to us. If you know what you want, you have the determination. No one can stop you but you. So I fully agree with you. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being part of Julius Mbaluto Live today. For viewers, that's all we have for you today. But join us again on Saturday, tackling a different topic or issue. So we'll leave you with to enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Of course, UK, I know some other countries it's nighttime, others are daytime or even very early in the morning. But wherever you are, have a fantastic time, and is over from us now from London.